Lay. Hello, and welcome to the first session of the webinar series, Fostering Green Recovery Through Climate Technologies. We have invited international experts to explore for different sectors and from different angles how the private sector and market mechanisms can accelerate technology transfer. These experts will discuss in a total of 4 webinars during 4 weeks. This webinar series is organized by the Implementing Office of the National Designated Entity Germany. NDE Germany is one of 158 focal points that have been created in the framework of the technology mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Our aim is to facilitate the introduction, use, and transfer of climate-related technologies worldwide. NDE Germany is hosted by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, on whose behalf the webinars are being organized. My name is Julia, and I'm hosting today's session together with my colleague Nancy, whose role I'm going to introduce in a bit. But first, let me give you a little bit of context for our webinars. The Paris Agreement was signed since 2016 by all members of the UNFCCC. The signing parties are aiming with this agreement at keeping the global average temperature below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The technology framework was set up in the Paris Agreement under Article 10, which also introduces technology transfer as a means to reaching the Paris Agreement's goals. During the next 4 weeks, we are asking our panelists to discuss the role of technology transfer in supporting decarbonization and emission reductions globally. We want to see how developed and developing countries can work together through technology transfer, which international mechanisms and standards should be implemented to help countries keep their national climate commitments, and which role can the private sector play in all of this. Also, we need to take into account the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic interventions are being designed in response to the global recession that the virus has caused. One of the main discussions revolves around the question how to manage an economic rebound whilst keeping or even improving climate goals. Because climate change continues to be a global long-term threat for humanity, notwithstanding other crises. In today's session, we are focusing on high-emitting industries and taking the cement and steel sector as examples for such industries that in many countries are key to achieving the transformation towards a low-carbon economy. We have assembled a diverse panel of experts to take a look at the necessary sectoral transformations in these specific industries and beyond. But before we start with our first speakers, allow me some remarks about the formalities of this online event. Our speakers will first provide some short inputs on today's topic. This is then followed by a panel discussion. As you might have noticed, as a listener, you are muted, but we want to make this an interactive session nonetheless. Therefore, your questions are highly welcome and appreciated. You can type your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see on the bottom of your screen, and you can ask either questions about one specific panelist or for the panel discussion in the end of the session. This is where my colleague Nancy will come in. She is making sure that all your questions will be integrated in the webinar. Nancy, if you quickly want to show yourself. Great. And of course, you can also tweet about today's event using our Twitter handle that you can see here. For some first opening remarks, I'm welcoming my colleague Dietram Oppelt from NDE Germany. Dietram, please.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I'm the representative of NDE Germany here, and we also welcome the Ministry of Energy and Economics in Germany, and Mr. Bornkamm will make a closing remark, and I will start then with the introduction. Julia, can you put in the presentation from? Exactly. So, yeah, so on behalf of Mr. Bornkamm, who will make the closing remark, I would like to welcome everyone. And next slide. Yeah, so we like to take this webinar as an opportunity to address the fostering of the climate agenda through the decoupling of economic growth and emissions. And there was just a recent article in The Economist who addressed the topic very well and basically showed that the world was quite successful in decoupling CO2 emissions in the past, as you can see in the little graph above, from the GDP growth. And especially after the last economic crisis in 2008, in the financial crisis, basically after that period, we saw already that CO2 emissions slowed down more than in the period before. So this was a good success, but it's by far not enough. Basically, to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we have to go to net zero carbon emissions worldwide by around 2050 latest. And so basically, the green recovery could be an opportunity for turning the point and going on an emission pathway, which is leading us in this direction. So with a series of webinars, and also with this webinar, we like to address basically how this can be achieved with climate technologies. Next slide. So for the series of webinars, we will go through different industries and different aspects of transfer and of climate technologies and climate technology corporations. And for this webinar, we'd like to start the discussion with the cement and the steel industry. And as you can see here from this chart, basically, in Western Europe, we already came down in the emissions from these two important industries quite significantly in the past. So basically from 1971 to 2020, we nearly halved the emissions in those industries. But the task is basically to go to something which is significantly lower by 2050. And as you can also see from this study by Van Rooyen in 2016, basically the carbon market mechanisms, which we also like to highlight in this webinar, play an important role. The task on a worldwide scheme is even bigger. In the worldwide, basically, the situation is that from 1971, we have dramatically increased the emissions towards 2020. So the task will be basically how we can transfer these climate technologies in this different, on the different technologies in cement and steel to achieve what has been achieved in Europe before, and basically go beyond this, both in Europe and worldwide. And I think I'm very excited about the contributions from our panelists to highlight this topic. And I would think I would give the word now over to our panelists, and also happy to see the contributions from the audience. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Dieter, for this entry. As a first panelist, I would like to invite Philipp Hauser from Europe, one of Europe's leading energy policy think tanks, Agora Energiewende. Philipp is a senior associate for industry in Latin America, and at Agora Energiewende, he is responsible for global energy and climate policies and also coordinates Agora's activities in Latin America. I will put up your presentation and then the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and to all the audience for your interest. It's a pleasure to give some introductory remarks from the perspective of Agora Energiewende's study on industry decarbonization, as well as some elements of a discussion paper that I presented at COP25 in December last year, and that I hope are helpful for this discussion. If we look at the first slide, please. I would pose that we are at the crossway. Could you pass the slide, please? At the crossway between a global Green Deal or the deal with global warming. If we look at the left, we see that we are far from reaching the Paris Agreement. There's a huge gap in emission, and we need a lot of global cooperation in order to close this gap and limit climate change to less than 2 degrees. On the other hand, IRENA tells us, and studies from Agora show that also for Europe, that climate change mitigation and economic expansion based on renewable energy is an economic opportunity. It does not only give us more resilience against climate change, it helps us to grow our economies and also provide more equitable and inclusive income to society. But in order to make that happen, we need huge investments. $90 trillion is the figure that we need to mobilize in building this green economy. And that is obviously very difficult for some countries if they don't have the financial resources, and even more so now after the COVID-19 crisis. So my argument is that international cooperation and carbon pricing are essential in order to move the needle. If we go to the next slide, we see some figures about the importance of industry. Industry, if we account for direct and indirect emissions, is responsible for 43% of global CO2 emissions. And steel, cement, and also chemical industries are responsible for half of that. If we can target these three sectors and decarbonize them, we will not only have the renewable raw materials that we need for the expansion of wind and solar, but we will also have made a huge stride against climate change. Going to the next slide, please. We see that the economic essentials of industry force us to be very strategic. The blast furnaces or cement kilns or chemical assets are long-term assets. We need to make sure that all investments taken today are compliant with a zero carbon future. If we miss the opportunity, then the costs will be very high. We will have stranded assets. But if we seize this opportunity with new investments, the abatement costs are relatively modest. We speak about $60 to $100 in the steel sectors, below 100 also in cement sector. In chemical, depending on technologies, it's a bit more expensive. This is expensive for many developing countries, but if we look at abatement costs in industrialized countries, this is actually relatively rational and feasible. With that, we can go to the next slide and start to discuss the European Green Deal, which makes use of this understanding in order to have a plan for decarbonization until 2050. Industrial decarbonization with an industrial strategy, a circular economy strategy, a hydrogen strategy, all this is fundamental, and Europe is now putting the legislative package in place to make sure that these investments can be made and are protected. One element of protection is that European industries will have to be protected from undue competition from other regions. We cannot accept that other industries compete and free ride on climate change. So ideally, we would engage in international negotiations to raise us all to a level playing field to make sure that the international industry decarbonizes at an equal path. As we have seen with those mitigation costs, obviously carbon market mechanisms will be very important for that. If we go to the next slide, you will see some principles that I developed as part of my discussion paper in December last year. Principles that I believe are important for discussion and definition of such market mechanisms. First, we need to mobilize private sector capital, mobilize it from countries with excess domestic savings to those countries where we have good opportunities to deploy such industries. Second, we need to do that within a sound enabling environment of those countries. And often this sound enabling environment has to be built. We need to be careful that international carbon pricing, climate finance is in synergy with those enabling environments. Third, it's essential that these investments are resilient to climate change, but also compatible with a zero carbon future. So we avoid stranded assets. Fourth and fifth together, this is about just transition. We need to support countries that reduce export and revenues from fossil fuel and help them in their just transition. But we also need to prepare countries that want to export, for example, hydrogen, in order to build the infrastructure in a way that they can also cater to domestic necessities. And finally, all this has to be happening very quickly. It has to be scalable, it has to be credible, and it needs to increase global ambition for greenhouse gas abatement. With these criteria, I have a final slide that I would like to present, which is a bit a discussion of the principles that we have in the Paris Agreement. You see a small visualization between Switzerland and Brazil, using the NDCs as a reference, not only for domestic ambition, but also for international accounting. We need to make sure that countries have economy-wide NDCs that can be a reference for such crediting and debiting of international transfers. Once we have that, the second point is that countries need to be very strategic in making a segmentation of the market between a low-cost abatement that they want to mobilize themselves with domestic resources in order to reach their NDC, but then also make strategic use of international cooperation to attract technology, the capital, and the cost differentials that we need to make those more transformational technologies that I have shown also available to those developing countries. To make that happen, we need a bit of time. We need to build the capacity. We need to build the institutions that can deal with the MRV, with the accounting, and that can appoint the specific roles to the private sector, both for domestic mitigation as well as international mitigation. But if we do that, I think we have a very sound fundament, as we see here depicted for Switzerland. Switzerland said in its NDC that it wants to make use of such international mechanisms. Brazil is open to such transfers as long as the government controls it. And then we can have this segmentation where part of the abatement is really promoted and achieved with domestic resources. But those activities that really go beyond domestic means can be supported with such international mechanisms for technology transfer, carbon pricing, and climate finance, and therefore help us to create the global cooperation that we need to be more effective for climate change mitigation, but also help those countries with the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Nancy, do we have already questions from the audience about this input?
No, there's no question at this point.
Okay, then there probably will be more when we're going towards the panel discussion at the end. So thank you, Philipp. And I would like to ask our second speaker to get ready. We are welcoming Nikolaus Wohlgemuth from First Climate. First Climate is offering consultancy and solutions in the fields of renewable energy, sustainable investments, and climate change mitigation. Nikolaus is a senior advisor there, and he's mainly responsible for the assessment, acquisition, and development of emission reduction projects internationally and also within Switzerland. And further, he supports governments in the implementation of MRV schemes to track achievement of their emission reduction pledges. I'm putting up your slides and then we can go ahead.
Good. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to this webinar. The content of my short presentation will be about the Article 6 piloting, which Switzerland currently is undertaking, and I will give a brief on this and also some conclusions whether technology transfer is already a big topic there. Next slide, please. So firstly, I wanted to just give you a brief overview of on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, because Article 6 is the most debated and most discussed and still not concluded on article of this act. Article 6 actually has more than two components, but the two components which are talking about trading emission reductions are Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Article 6.2 sets the cooperative approaches between countries. So this lines out how emission reductions can be traded between industrialized and developing countries, or also between developing countries and also between industrialized countries. There are actually no restrictions here. Article 6.4 would be the continuation of an international voluntary mechanism, like the CDM was, International Market for Carbon. And the interesting thing now in this discussion is that Article 6.2 is more or less, there's no general consensus, but the framework more or less exists after COP26. And Article 6.4, there is no agreement reached at all, and it's not very clear how this will continue. Next slide, please. So I will now continue to discuss Article 6.2 as Switzerland, the country where First Climate is based in, is already piloting projects under this Article 6.2, although the rules and regulations are not entirely clear. The main content is already tailored out. So how does this work? Here, the example of Switzerland and Mexico. So Switzerland provides finance for emission reduction activities in Mexico through the purchase of ITMOs. This is a kind of a result-based finance where Switzerland purchases emission reductions, so-called internationally transferable mitigation options from Mexico, from projects in Mexico, and pays upon the receipt of the emission reduction. Technology can also be provided by Swiss companies, but these projects theoretically can also be developed within the country. What is a very important component under this Article 6 is the corresponding adjustment between Switzerland and Mexico, which is in a contract between the countries, meaning that the transfer of carbon credits, which Switzerland now takes into account for itself, has to be deducted from Mexico's NDC, so that double counting is avoided. The next slide, please. So these corresponding adjustments do have four pillars actually, which are very important and which are also part of the Paris Agreement. So environmental integrity of the projects has to be ensured. The ITMO transfer, so the transfer of the emission reduction, has to be correctly accounted in both countries, and the transaction should contribute to sustainable development and safeguard human rights. These conditions will be set in this contract between the governments, and only after this contract is signed and agreed upon by the governments, the ITMO transfer can happen. Next slide, please. Why is Switzerland doing this? Switzerland is doing this because in Switzerland there is a CO2 law which foresees that until 2030, 20% of the emission reductions can be achieved by projects abroad. These 20% should be achieved then by such ITMO Article 6.2 projects, and the Swiss government gave the mandate to the Association or Foundation for Climate Protection and Carbon Offset, CLIC, to actually already now purchase or start purchasing and entering into acquisition of projects which would fulfill these criteria. There have been two tenders launched and 4 projects, the ones listed below in Ghana, Peru, Morocco, and Senegal, have been contracted. Next slide, please. The criteria of the corresponding adjustment was now transferred by this association CLIC into tendering criteria for the project. So selection criteria have been set, which are somehow mirroring the requirements of the Swiss government for the project. What is clear is that these 4 pillars mentioned before of the Paris Agreement should be clearly outlined there, but there are also other criteria which are more on a commercial basis, project-based criteria, so that the project is then also successfully getting into operation. The business model is plausible, that there's no risk of, or low risk of corruption, bad governance, and so on and so forth. Now, looking at this piloting mechanism, I asked myself the question whether now this is already something where benchmarks for technology are considered, and I will conclude with the last slide of my presentation. So yeah, this program so far looks very much at the carbon part of the programs, the projects which are acquired. What is of course clear is that the carbon part needs to be monitored, and permanence needs to be shown, and carbon plays a convincing role for each project. What is further clear is that the financiers, so the association CLIC, which purchases the carbon credits, the ITMOs, has a strong interest that the project is viable, and the counterparty is reliable and risks are low. It's also important that SDGs are supported, that human rights are respected, and that the sector the project is in is covered in the host country NDC. So this last point, the host country NDC, is important for the accounting. When you look at NDCs of different countries, you see that, of course, energy intense technologies like steel or cement production are mostly covered in the NDC because they're also fairly easy to monitor, while other sectors like agricultural sector are much more difficult to monitor. And to ensure proper accounting between the countries in the corresponding adjustment, the coverage of the emissions in the NDC, or the accounting in the emissions in the NDC, is a precondition. So far, in the projects which have been proposed, technology benchmarks are not considered yet directly, except for their link to the role of carbon. So, of course, the more emission reductions a project can acquire for lesser costs, the higher chances it has to get finance from this purchase program of Switzerland, because also the price of carbon is playing a role here. Yeah, this is my presentation. Thank you very much. If you have some questions afterwards, I can answer them, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolaus. Nancy, again, do we have questions to Nikolaus?
There's no specific question to Nikolaus. There's some questions are coming in for Philipp Hauser, but we can maybe address them just afterwards once we start with the question and answer session.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Okay. Then we'll go over to our next panelist, Christoph Reißfelder. We're very happy to welcome him here. He is from HeidelbergCement, the second largest cement producer worldwide. And Christoph, as Group Communication and Investor Relations in his position, he coordinates all governmental affairs for the company in Germany. So Christoph, please.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can see my presentation and can hear me. We can switch immediately to the next slide. So what I wanted to do, because NDE posed actually a lot of questions to me in preparing my presentation, and I hope I can somehow accustom most of them. I would start in giving you a rough picture on long-term and full-fledged decarbonization of cement production and where the challenges lie. Then I will go a little bit into the topic of the policy environment in Europe and Germany, which steers somehow the decarbonization efforts. Then I would quickly jump to the industry commitment that we have for Europe derived from this political framework. And in light with that, to conclude my presentation, I would speak a little bit about the relevance of Article 6 for cement production in general. So we can switch to the next slide, please. Some of you might be familiar with cement production, others might not. I will not go into details, but I want to give you one core message, and that is that process emissions are the biggest challenge in fully decarbonizing the cement industry. What I mean with process emissions is the following, that you can see on the left side. What we are basically doing is we quarry limestone, we grind it fine, heat the limestone as a raw material, and burn it in a huge kiln. This process is being called calcination of limestone, and due to the nature of the limestone and this process, we have actually a process emission, so an unavoidable emission that is coming from the calcination of limestone. From a chemical perspective, CaCO3 becomes CaO and CO2. When you look on the right side, then in the overall profile of emissions in cement productions, you can actually see that these process emissions are the biggest challenge that we have. They make up 2/3 of our CO2 emissions profile, while only 1/3 is determined by the fuels used in the kiln. And there we have some strategies by utilizing alternative fuels and biomass to bring these 1/3 of emissions down, but the 2/3 are really a challenge. Next slide, please. And actually, there is only one way to make a large-scale decarbonization of these process emissions, and this is going down the route of CCUS, or carbon capture and utilization or storage. And we are looking actually as a global company in 3 different technologies for that. The first one is a so-called amine technology, or it's basically a post-combustion technology that you put at the back of an existing cement plant and capture the CO2, for example, via an amine scrubber. The second technology that we are currently investigating and scaling is the so-called lilac technology. This is really a direct CO2 capture in a separate flue gas stream by indirectly heating the raw material, which means from the limestone that is being calcined, the CO2 that emanates from the limestone is directly captured. The third technology that we are looking into is really a completely new process technology, the so-called OxyFuel technology, where we use actually a pure combustion condition by burning the fuels in a pure oxygen atmosphere and looping the CO2 within the process and increasing the CO2 concentration in our flue gas. So these are basically the 3 technologies that we are looking into to tackle the issue of process emissions, and which will play quite a role when I come back to that in discussing the relevance of Article 6. Next slide, please. As I have been asked to provide you a little bit an overview of what determines carbon standards for cement industry, we have to basically look at the European Union level, because these standards primarily determine what we are doing, and this drives and incentivizes actually our actions. So first of all, of course, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, where just recently a quite ambitious benchmark has been set for clinker. This is the CO2 intensive component in cement from the calcination of limestone. This is set at 666 kilogram of CO2 per ton of clinker. And ultimately, what we are seeing currently in the EU, the discussion on a new headline target and how this will translate in further ambition in the EU ETS, will ultimately determine free allocation, which is rather important for us, as we are not operating in the level playing field. As Philipp mentioned earlier on, this is a quite crucial element that we need to be successful with our decarbonization pathway. The next standard that is coming up currently is the EU taxonomy. So for those of you who are not aware of that, actually there's a huge discussion going on in Brussels how to determine a sustainable technology and what criterions should be applied to doing so. And actually within this EU taxonomy debate, also a benchmark set for cement has been come up, which is a quite ambitious benchmark, roughly 500 kilograms per ton of cement. On top, the so-called do not harm criteria add on that as well. A third driver somehow to drive carbon standards in cement industry is basically the so-called BREFs. There's a specific BREF for cement and lime. BREF is a so-called best available technology reference document. These documents determine if you build a new cement plant or revamp a cement plant, which technologies you have to build into the cement plant. And as these standards are getting, with every review of this BREF document, stricter and stricter, this drives, of course, ambition. On the national level in Germany, we do not have any specific carbon standards apart from these BATs, but we see some indirect standards that are pushing actually on our CO2 performance. And this is first of all energy efficiency targets and demands that are arising from certain compensation schemes and energy management systems. And a quite recent addition on that is, of course, the so-called National Emissions Trading System or scheme that has been implemented in Germany, which will increase the cost burden of CO2 for our operations. Next slide, please. As you can see, we as European cement industry and the HeidelbergCement specifically, we aim for carbon neutrality in 2050 and are therefore quite aligned with what is going on the international level and what is being the mind of the Paris Agreement. So I want to show you on that slide, especially the lower part of this circle, which is red, and this is the importance of CCU, CCS for decarbonization of cement industry, basically. If CCS, CCU technologies will not be deployed soon, we are in big trouble to achieve the goal of having zero emissions in 2050 along the value chain. Next slide, please. And this leads me ultimately to Article 6 and why it's so relevant also for cement industry. And this is basically for two reasons. First reason is Article 6 has the potential to create a level playing field globally if it's implemented correctly. And secondly, Article 6 has the potential to reduce the cost of decarbonization, not only for us as a company, but generally for the whole society and the world. Maybe starting with creating a level playing field. For that, Article 6.2 is quite relevant because from our perspective, it's primarily about carbon markets and maybe less about a system similar to CDM. This would be Article 6.4 basically. So Article 6.2 is actually quite crucial because we all know from experience carbon markets internalize carbon cost, and I can speak for my board members if I say if this cost increases, they are looking into it quite strongly. Therefore, creating and linking carbon markets globally lessens the risk of carbon leakage in comparison to countries that are less ambitious at the current point in time. So therefore, this enables really the potential to invest in carbon reductions, even if they create additional capex and opex burdens. To make this work, really, one important thing needs to be mentioned, and this is that the level of ambition must be the same in all markets to create a global level playing field. I know that there are some discussions also in the World Bank going on of having something like FX rates for different carbon schemes for linking them, but this is quite crucial. The ambition level must be at least translatable or ideally the same. Then maybe going to Article 6.4, this is quite crucial because it creates momentum and learning in less advanced countries for policy change as well. So not only looking into the technologies, but it creates also a momentum for new technologies to be implemented in areas or practices in areas that have not been there. For example, when you look to Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, you see that the utilization of alternative fuels and biomass in cement production is relatively low compared to countries like Germany or France. Going that route, and then also thinking about developing in emerging markets, this is actually a quite good way of pushing these technologies and practices there as well, which links me to reducing the cost of decarbonization. Because internationally trading credits from emissions reduction creates cost efficiency by allowing to reap low-hanging fruits, for examples, in the alternative fuels world, or the substitution of the CO2-intensive clinker, which can be done to a certain extent. However, creating room for public investment by reducing burdens on public households in light of more ambitious EU headline targets is a key component in that as well to make that work. So what we need to do is actually that by creating these mechanisms similar to CDM potentially, we actually can create incomes that can then be reused for decarbonization. And maybe a last point on that, looking into the technology transfer, because I think this is quite crucial for a lot of you guys. I think Hans-Jörn Wendige will tell a little bit more on that front. Is from our perspective, we see technology transfers basically as a tool to create potential for cost-efficient build-up, especially of transformative infrastructures, because the technologies that we are looking into from the cement perspective, CCUS, basically is not just a technology that I need at the cement plant. I need ultimately transformative infrastructures for hydrogen, for CO2, for renewable energy, to make a really systemic switch or transformation of the economic system towards a hydrogen carbon-based circular economy. From that perspective, technology transfer, and especially looking how to build up cross-border cooperation on these infrastructures, is from our perspective quite crucial. And this is all what I would say on that for the moment. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Nancy, do we have questions?
Yes, there is a question to Christoph. The question is, amongst the three technologies you have mentioned, which is the technology that's most efficient in reducing process emissions? And then the second question regarding this is, can this technology be easily accessed by cement producing companies in developing countries? And what are the cost implications?
So maybe starting with the first question on what is the most efficient technology. From a cost perspective, I can only say it depends on the location and geography you are operating in. To give you an example, the LILAC technology is really focusing on the process emissions. If you have enough biomass available to also then make your fuel side carbon neutral, this is a quite promising technology because you do not need to add additional energy to purify the CO2 in that technology. So from that perspective, it is for certain regions a quite efficient technology, while if you're thinking of rebuilding a cement plant, coming back what Philipp Hauser said in the beginning, there is some reinvest demand. It might be smart potentially to use the OxyFuel technology and build a completely new plant. Meanwhile, going to the post-combustion technologies, these might be technologies that are crucially interesting for developing and emerging markets, because you have your existing asset and you actually add an additional installation to that asset, and you do not need to massively revamp your asset in running that technology. However, the downside of AMAM capture, for example, is that you need additional energy in the end of the day to purify your CO2 and to utilize your CO2. So all of these three technologies have their pros and cons, and it really depends on the locations you operate in. And also factors like energy prices, for example, play a crucial role into the decide from an economic perspective, which is the most efficient and most effective technology for this specific plant. So there's not an one size fits all solution, and that's also the reason that we are looking into all of these three technologies, basically. Maybe coming to the second question that has been asked. If I understood correctly, please help me again. The second question was concerned with
the second. Sorry. The second question was if this technology can be, or those three technologies can be easily accessed by cement producing companies in developing countries.
In theory, yes and no, I have to say. So we are speaking really about low carbon breakthrough technologies, and a lot of scale up of and testing of these technologies is still to be done. I would say from a technology readiness perspective, combustion technologies like amine capture are very likely the most proliferated and the most advanced technologies at the current point in time. But nevertheless, we are doing these scaling operations. And in the end of the day, this is a question that I actually would pose to Hans-Jörn Wendige and the subsidiary of thyssenkrupp, which is thyssenkrupp International Services, because this is more a question on IP rights and the guys who will be building these installations at the end of the day. So I think in principle, they are all available to some extent at the current point in time already. And it's just a question of having the incentive and the business case of building these installations. And then I refer back to the question of available infrastructure, energy prices, and the general willingness to pay for greener but likely more expensive products, at least for the transition phase. Yeah.
Thank you, Christoph. You already mentioned our next speaker, so I will take the chance to move over to the next presentation. Our next and last speaker is Hans-Jörn Wendige from thyssenkrupp, which is a multinational conglomerate with focus on industrial engineering and steel production. Hans-Jörn coordinates energy, climate, and environmental policies across the thyssenkrupp group. And he is also a business, industry, and NGO observer at the UNFCCC Technology Executive Committee Tech. Welcome, Hans-Jörn.
Thanks a lot. And if you could get the first slide up, please. Or actually, the second would do. Yes. Sorry, that's a third, but no matter. We start with this one. What I just wanted to say is, like other companies, and Christopher hasn't really mentioned what they are doing, we certainly have committed to a climate neutral approach by 2050. Specific for us is that we say we need to go across scope 1 and 2, but also across 3. And what's also very important is that, and that would be then the next slide, please, is it's very easy to do goals for 2050. So we need to have midterm points. So for 2030, we basically say 30% in scope 1 and 2. For those of you not that familiar with the jargon, basically that's what comes out of our own chimneys, or what comes, loosely speaking, out of the chimneys of the electricity producers, whose electricity we use, plus 16% reduction in scope 3. And scope 3 is basically the emissions from our products. And that certainly is quite important because, as Christopher just mentioned, we are, amongst many other products, producing cement plants. And certainly that's a very important lever, that the cement plants HeidelbergCement will be buying from us in the future will actually be much less CO2 emitting than in the past. So if we go to the next slide, the big question certainly is, how do we want to achieve that? And certainly with having mentioned scope 3, it's very clear it's not just in the thyssenkrupp universe that you can do it, but you really have to look at several things. So let me start, since you wanted to have a little bit on steel on the next slide, please. In steel, we actually have the issue that one of the earlier slides was a little bit wrong, because it's not about fuel for steel making so much. It's really about the chemical process of getting the oxygen atom away from the iron ore. And therefore, we basically have two ways. It's a little bit too small, I think, for some of you to read, but very roughly, the top part basically is, since you can't avoid it if you use carbon chemically, then try to do something with it. That's CCU, so carbon capture and use. Also technology, certainly, as Christopher mentioned, we will indispensably need in the cement sector and many others. And the bottom part is the very famous way of hydrogen use, so hydrogen metallurgy. If you replace carbon with hydrogen, you, by definition, can't get CO2, you get H2O, basically water, which is certainly climate-wise much easier to use. So that basically are the two main ways in steel making moving forward. Just to give you on the next slide, that all depends certainly on renewable energy and water electrolysis, so meaning green hydrogen. What's very important for us is we are not just seeing that for steel making, coming back to that we also are a plant manufacturer in the chemical industry as well as in the cement industry. We see a number of processes where that actually works in order to get hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, methane, so basically all the building blocks of our modern world into green. And then on the next one, next slide, please, we see what Christoph mentioned, OxyFuel as one of the sustainable solutions for cement. There are a number of others. Certainly very important here, it needs to be included into other industries, be it plastics, fertilizers, whatever, unless we really want just to store it. And that's, I think, one of the important things we need to look cross industry. So if we briefly take a look at the next slide, for me as an engineer, from a technical point of view, seems to be okay. We have all the building blocks we need. However, going one step further, why aren't we seeing it yet? This is, and I don't want to go into too much detail, this tries to basically in 3 columns describe how is actually international climate target setting and climate ambition working. You have on the very left the actual national pillar, if you like. You have the situation, you have an NDC where you want to define what you want to do. This needs to be supported by climate plans, climate laws, and so on and so forth. And you definitely do that in your local society because it needs to be done by someone. We have a process in the middle, which is actually quite interesting. Here, I think in this audience, we might have a number of people knowing about it, but generally it's not as well known as it should be, which is under the UNFCCC tag, the sole process of TNAs, technology needs assessments, because the question is, you can set yourself a goal, but the issue is not about setting a goal, the issue is about reaching it, having a plan, and that's where technology needs assessments, TNAs, or the so-called TAPs, technology action plans, are important. What do you need in terms of technologies? How do you get it? And how do you make then at the bottom bankable projects out of it? And this is actually where it now certainly concludes to the issue that you need to finance it, because as Christoph has mentioned, there is not really much technology out there you can't buy. I think nearly all technology that you need to become climate friendly, climate neutral can be bought on the market. However, there's a price for it, and therefore the very right-hand column, financing, becomes extremely important. And that's where the Article 6 and all those variants which have been described before certainly come into play. And if you go to the next one, please, we now certainly see 3 areas where regulations play an important role. In climate plans, laws, they can come in many different versions. Some of them, like the EU, say we make an emission trading systems. Others say we do performance standards, so we basically tell you what to do, and so on and so forth. For Article 6, I come back to that in a moment a little bit more in detail. Certainly also rules are important. What do we talk about? Because if we want to transfer something, as it was already indicated, we should be sure that we really have achieved a physical reduction of CO2 and other greenhouse gas somewhere, and not just make a great accounting trick. And at the end of the day, for bankable projects, this is where it really matters most. Therefore, on the next one, please, what's really key, and this is where we are lacking, is coherent rules and regulations in all these areas. If you don't have a good national regulation, you don't know what to do. If you don't have a clear idea about bankable projects, Article 6, you will have nobody who is willing to finance that because they're not being described what they really want. So much for theory. Now let's look very briefly on reality. Article 6 Paris Agreement, as it was mentioned, great, a lot of things, but most importantly, please don't forget, we still don't have the rule book. We still don't have generally accepted rules for it. And that's really what's retarding the thing, because climate action needs to go on. Secondly, we were asked EU ETS and Article 6. It's very important. Both of them speak about certificates or whatever. However, they're completely separated. For the time being, there's no interface between the two. Just to the contrary, the CDMs being mentioned before have actually been mostly excluded from the EU ETS as of 2012, which certainly had huge impact on the whole CDM process. And on the next one, therefore, certainly also the Article 6 and are different regulations. Sorry, there's a mistake. It should actually read not EU ETS there. It should read performance standards. And this is actually the difference of the approaches, because on the one hand, you basically tell people what to do. So you need to have a very good idea what's the best way forward. It's a planned economy, if you like. On the other one, you go to markets and other things. However, you need some kind of baseline and whatever, so it's not completely excluding from each other. However, all of that is missing. And for the last one, just to show you a little bit the issues, if I speak to the guys in my company who do steel making, they certainly sit at a certain location and they are very interested or afraid of what might be coming in. So you have an import view. This is very different from if I speak to our plant engineers who want to sell something abroad. So this whole issue of how do you get different parts of the world together, how do you align an import and an export view, are extremely important in order to avoid something which I think is very crucial, that we don't see protectionism coming up more and more, but really remind ourselves that climate protection, climate action needs to be global, because it's only global that we get it done. Hence, we need to help each other. And that's one of the reasons why I hope, coming back to point 1 here, we have an Article 6 very quickly, because I fully agree this will be an important one. That would be on the next one, actually, what I would say as an opening comment. And I'm very keen to talk with all of you about what it means and how do we go on, because at the end of the day, we should be leaving here doing action rather than having talked ourselves just about the solution.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jörn. Nancy, do we have direct questions to this presentation?
We do have a lot of questions coming in, but directly to this presentation, no, there is no direct question.
Perfect. Then I suggest that we go directly into the panel discussion. I would like to ask all speakers to turn on their camera so that we can see you.
I guess you will have to turn on mine.
I have to turn on yours. Okay. Yes. There you are. Great. Thank you very much for this very interesting inputs that you all provided. I think we're all very keen to see how they can fit together and how we can make a bigger picture out of it. So first of all, maybe I would like to go back to the second presentation where we saw some concrete examples for piloting in the implementation of Article 6 in Switzerland. And maybe, Philipp, you could start with a comment on if these pilots that we've seen that allow trading of credits on an international market could be an interesting approach for the European Union, and what could be the requirements for such a market mechanism.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Nikolaus, for this presentation. As I've used it, I think Switzerland is a very interesting example because it made very strategic use of international markets in its NDC. And I think that is really a good example for Europe also. Europe at the moment is more focusing on domestic climate neutrality and is leaving the discussion on international cooperation a bit to the second step. Therefore, my answer is yes, I think we could learn a lot from the Swiss approach to it. But I think we need another element, which is to be more strategic in using these partnerships, helping other countries to promote just transition or to build the strategic infrastructure of the energy systems of the future. And there, I would have a question for Nikolaus. You mentioned that one of the criteria is cost effectiveness. Now, if you have the different countries compete against each other offering low cost abatements, basically that means that you cannot support them with really transformational investments that go beyond their domestic means. And we would again be in the logic of the CDM, where the cheapest offset is being traded instead of really having a system that supports countries with the heavy lifting. So I would like to see your reflection on this trade-off between low-hanging fruit, cost effectiveness, and transformational technology.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. That that this point is actually a weakness, but this is the weakness and also the beauty of carbon markets. I think that you buy or achieve the emission reduction there where you can actually, achieve the biggest emission reduction at the lowest cost. To achieve transformational change and to support the government in implementing long-term vision how to reduce emission reductions, I think probably a market mechanism is not the right tool. It might be that rather other articles of the Paris Agreement are more towards that goal. Did I answer your question?
Well, if I may react, I would say yes. If you leave market unregulated, that is what will happen. But as I mentioned in my presentation, I believe that host countries will have to regulate and make sure that only transformational investments are being exported and low-cost abatement is kept to domestic abatement. But that also requires that the buyers participate in such an approach. Otherwise, we will have a competition and a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
If I may jump in on this point, I think one thing that's very important to keep in mind is we have a change to the CDM that has nothing to do with the CDM, but with the framework. When we had the CDM, we had certificates coming from countries which themselves didn't really have a reduction obligation. This has now changed. So basically the value for each host country is to see, do I need it for my own NDC or is it something on top? And this will mean that we most probably will not see that 50 cent a ton certificates coming up anymore. And the question will really be, what is actually the price level? And depending on the price level, we might be seeing a lot of technologies coming into the market, which can be co-financed by this Article 6. And if we just for a moment pause and look at it from another point of view, certainly it is very important that for long-term investments like a cement plant and whatever else, we find specific solutions, because here the negative impact of not doing it right will stay there for another 30 to 60 years. If we have somebody buying still a combustion engine car rather than an electric one, this is something that we can solve in another 12 years when the car is at the end of its lifetime. Some other technologies even quicker. So I don't think we see that race to the bottom necessarily, or it's much easier to avoid that race than it was in the CDM part, where we had, if you like, an infinite surplus of these certificates that could be just printed more or less.
Maybe to add on that, I fully agree with Hans-Jörn on that point, because this is the crucial game changer. Everybody now has a commitment, and this actually leads to the situation when you look into the dynamic discussions in Europe on the effort sharing regulation. It's the same basically. So you want to create the most cost efficient emissions reductions for yourself, and I think also the additionality topic is quite crucial in that. And in the end of the day, you will likely see in such a mechanism, due to the commitments, that additionality will be a guiding principle for these projects in the end of the day.
However, just to also make sure this is not just sun, but also shadows out there, where we will now see that discussion happening is in the revision of the NDCs. Nikolaus, you have mentioned that Switzerland looks at the fact, how is the NDC looking of another country, and is it really part of the NDC, so that we really don't have, if you like, a free emission being traded. And this will be the discussion that certainly is now going to be coming up more and more. How ambitious can I be in my own NDC, and how much will be left for an Article 6 tradable one, be it 6.2, be it 6.4?
Yeah, when I may react on that, yes. So Switzerland looks very, very in much detail on the NDC of the host country they want to enter into an agreement with, and I think this is exactly, it's a pilot system now, but if I may also criticize the system, I think this is somehow a problem, because what is in the NDC are normally the potentials which a country can reduce more or less easily because it is aware of. But the potentials which a country not can easily reduce and where additional support is needed are not, or often not, mirrored in the NDC appropriately. And there, this mechanism, as piloted by Switzerland, does not really help so far, I mean, at this point.
Which is quite interesting, because that's what we see in the TNA process, for example, that most early TNAs had, if you like, the obvious solutions. And it's only recently that people looked then at other things as well, particularly when they realized, okay, this is also about trying to identify what's possible. And therefore, a functioning Article 6.1 with the condition you need to have that sector in your NDC before it's eligible for an Article 6.1 might actually change the game here on the positive side as well, as long as people don't say, fine, we put the steel and cement industry in, and we basically have an NDC that this has 1 ton of CO2 less in 20 years than today, and all the rest is open for Article 6. So there we will again have to look at the stringency of NDCs a little bit. But it's, I think, very important to keep the 3 streams, the national climate law NDC one, the Article 6 one, and the technology needs assessment, TAPs, and so on, all together as one system. And then I'm very confident it can work.
Since you mentioned the technology needs assessment, maybe we can look a bit into specific technologies that would be needed also to, that we should promote specifically in the steel and cement industry, to promote technology cooperation in order to mitigate emissions in developing countries. Do you have any specific technologies in mind there, maybe?
If I might jump in, I saw this question in other terms in our chat. So what would be the no regret technologies for developing countries? And Hans-Jörn already said it. The first thing is renewable energy. We can only really decarbonize society, transport, and industry if we have enough renewable energy. So investing in the expansion of renewables is fundamental. And I see a bit critical that under the CDM, for example, people now say that renewables are do no longer deserve support because they would be so cost effective. They are cost effective, but they are also very capital intensive. So sound schemes to finance and expand renewables is the fundament. Second, if I look at the steel sector, I believe there are a lot of opportunities to jump to direct reduced iron with natural gas, especially where you have a lot of natural gas available. The emission reduction from coal to natural gas is 60%. But more interesting, this installation is hydrogen ready. It can be designed in a way that it's hydrogen ready. So for the future, you can then do the final switch to full carbon neutrality. And last, and this is a hypothesis that I'd like to play to Christoph, I think in many developing countries where you have opportunities for sustainable biomass, you could position cement kilns in a way that they use sustainable biomass. Therefore, there are already low carbon assets, but in future they could be converted into bio-CCS. And that will be a very valuable activity after the 2030s, and maybe a strategic position also for developing countries.
So maybe add on to that directly. This is actually what I wanted to say. I think the first step when looking into emerging markets and developing countries is actually maybe less a technology challenge, more a policy framework challenge. For example, alternative fuels or biomass fuels. When you look into the rates, also for our company and the plants, when I look into Indonesia, then there are some big steps going on also in association with the NDC of Indonesia. But you see a lot of countries where the huge biomass potential and it's not being taken up, either because the waste collection and separation systems are not in place, the policies are not there, or it's just merely overlooked, actually. So there's a huge potential, and these are also no regret measures. We are then already fundamentally reducing the CO2 footprint of cement by tackling the 1/3 from the fuels emissions without having the huge discussion on CCS. This will come at a later stage for sure, but as a starting point, especially topics like alternative fuels and biomass are the no regret measure that should be taken up, and this is the first step. But as I said, this is less a technology question, because this is technology that is easily proliferated. It's more a political framework question in the end of the day.
If I may add on that, I think it's very important that we don't get the idea there is the one technology that's best. There is no silver bullet. It depends, as Christopher said, on the location. It depends on a number of things. The other thing, and Philipp, I would like to take you up on that, is certainly very important that we really look over a longer time horizon. You mentioned developing countries. We have a similar issue in the European Union. We were able at the moment to build a hydrogen-based direct reduction plant. However, we would not be able to operate that one because you cannot operate these plants at, say, 10% of capacity, but we wouldn't be having enough hydrogen available. That's one of the reasons why we are looking exactly into these things, because we think if we now build another series of blast furnaces, which run for another 25 years, this is technologically very easy, but it might not be the best climate solution. So I would like to bring these two things together, and I would like to say it's very important not just to look at single technologies, pieces of equipment. They're all available on the market, and it's only a question of how much money you raise to buy them. However, you need the systems and industrial ecosystems and infrastructures in order to get them working, get them together. And that, we believe, is actually where a lot of countries have much more to do. So it's not just a shopping list of technologies, it's take a cement plant to make sure how do you get an infrastructure to get CO2 which is captured away, or how to use it, or just making sure there's another pipeline for the methanol you produce with it, or whatever else. And that's very often overlooked if we discuss about individual technologies, but it's always a system.
No, I'd really like to support that, because we need to transition from the industrial ecosystems that we have today to completely new arrays. And it takes this long-term vision to identify those no regret options that are capable now, that bring us part of the road, but that open the path to carbon neutrality after 2050. Fully agree.
At this point, I would like to maybe see, Nancy, what questions we have from the audience.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we had some questions coming in. One of the question was, the discussion is pretty much focusing on mitigation. The question is, what are the adaptation co-benefit opportunities that this is a question to all of you, that you would see relatively to the topic that's been discussed right now?
So maybe I start from a cement perspective. Of course, I think our product has to play a role when it comes to abatement in the end, and adaptation in the end of the day, because it's about resilient infrastructure, especially. So from that perspective, I think cement and especially concrete are construction materials that help you in adaptation to climate change, while also giving a benefit from a mitigation perspective when you look at it from a life cycle perspective. For example, when you take energy gains or reduced energy demand due to thermal mass during the use phase of a building, for example, recyclability of the construction material, etc. So there's a link, at least from a product side, between adaptation and mitigation, at least when you're looking into cement and concrete. From a general perspective on adaptation, I have to say that this is somehow also my company position. We think mitigation is much better and timely mitigation, so to speak. Timely mitigation should be the priority for us as a company, in a sense, because then we can lessen the burden for adaptation in the end.
I mean, what's also very important is we can discuss here mitigation for the world.
Mm-hmm.
We can't discuss adaptation here in general because it is so much location specific. If you look at the issue of technology transfer, and it's much more difficult to actually identify what it really is. I mean, take stockyards for products. 30 years ago, you wouldn't cover a stockyard. Today, you do cover a stockyard, but why do you do it? Do you do it because there is more rain due to climate change coming? Because your workers today are not willing to work in the rain if needed, so they expect protection even so the weather might not have changed? Is it your customer demand that it's not fine enough anymore to leave the stuff out in the open, and so on and so forth? That's a general problem the NDE, I remember, very well had when we tried to get together a list of adaptation solutions of the German industry for the rest of the world. Because take a water pump. This is much more difficult to see, is it adaptation or just business as usual? If you take an OxyFuel cement plant, you know immediately the only added reason for having it is climate mitigation.
It's very interesting to listen to you, but looking at the time, I feel we'll have to stop our discussion. It was really interesting to get an insight into the heavy industry and to actually see that there are a lot of low carbon solutions already there. The industry is ready, but yeah, standards are very important here to have robust development. Also, you mentioned that the NDCs need to have robust standards and all of this. And so market mechanisms could play a role in this and play an important role. And also climate technology corporations could be supportive of this process. So I would first of all like to thank all of you for your input in the panel discussion. I know that we have quite a few more questions in the chat and also in the Q&A box. So we will have a look at them after the session. They won't be forgotten, and we will try to answer them in a written form and provide them on the website. You will receive information about that via email. We are very lucky also that the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy joined us. So I would, for a brief closing remarks, pass over to Malte Bornkamm. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Malte Bornkamm. I'm head of unit of climate change and international environmental policy in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and we also base of the German NDE. So thanks for this very interesting discussion. At least for me, it was there are quite a few new insights. And at the end of the debate, I'd just like to highlight maybe like the bigger picture a little bit. We've seen, well, we're in the middle of a huge economic crisis, and where we don't know where the economy will go to, and we don't know where the emissions will go to. So whether we will see like after the last crisis, at least in Europe, lower development path, or whether we'll come out of the crisis maybe even stronger, and how we can use the recovery measures to tackle the crisis in order to align climate policy objectives and to further new technologies. So I think we've seen a lot of progress in the last years and decades in decoupling economic growth from emissions. But what is finally asked for is a total decoupling and a total carbon neutrality until 2050. And of course, this is a major challenge, especially in the basic materials industries, as we've been discussing today. And what's also clear is that we will need global solutions here, because Europe's share in this area is only 2 to 3%. So we need global solutions, and we need to find a way how to also share technologies which are being developed in industrialized nations and with all other partners in the world. So so the question is, what role do we have here for market mechanisms? What role we have for carbon pricing? But also, of course, what role do you have for the technology mechanism, and which may be like a first step, like a first cornerstone to get there, especially maybe also for countries which are a bit reluctant to go on carbon pricing directly, but maybe look at other forms of cooperation in the first place. And also having the situation that the EU hasn't decided yet how to behave, let's say, regarding Article 6. And so I think these are very interesting questions, and I've heard a lot of new keywords like ecosystem solutions, that you also have to look at the infrastructure and the overall industrial needs that you need for new technologies. And I think, well, that we also have to look at adaptation, of course, at the same time. And I think if we look at like more integrated solutions, like industrial ecosystems, I think that's also a way to also look at both sides, mitigation and adaptation at the same time. So for me, it was very interesting. I hope that the webinar series will help to highlight more issues along this along this challenge. So thank you for the organization, to all panel speakers from my side, and I hope it was interesting for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Bornkamm. You already mentioned this is a webinar series, so our discussion, of course, doesn't end here today, even though our panelists are leaving also in a few minutes. We would like to welcome you again for the next sessions. We are starting next week with the session on June 3rd, always Wednesdays, 3 o'clock. We have invited Katharine Wagner and Graham Smith from HSBC, who are going to discuss with Frank Wolke from DEST, which is the German Emissions Trading Authority, and Stefanos Minas, who's Vice Chair of the Technology Executive Committee of Tech of UNFCCC that we already mentioned today. They will discuss public and private opportunities to finance technology transfer of climate technologies. The week after, on June 10th, we're having a closer look at corporations and how how institutions can support the implementation of technology corporations. We have a case study for a corporation from Africa, and very lucky to welcome the director of CTCN. And a week after, we are looking into the sectoral transformation and transport and how to accelerate this through the example of electric mobility. So thank you for all of you who listened in today. And we are really hoping to see you again in the next sessions. Big thank you again to all of our panelists for taking the time and for providing this very interesting inputs and the discussion. And have a good day.